let's get started. So welcome everybody, and over to you, Magnus, to kick us off.
Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this session of the UN 75 Global Governance Forum, which is on global climate governance, the Paris Agreement and beyond. So on behalf of the Global Challenges Foundation and the other partners of this forum, the Stimson Center, One Earth Future Foundation, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung New York office, and the Global Governance Philanthropy Network, I want to thank you all very much for joining this forum and for joining this session of the forum. My name is Magnus Ibon. I'm head of research at the Global Challenges Foundation, and I will moderate this session together with my colleague Maya Groff, who is an international lawyer in The Hague. She's also a visiting professor at Leiden University and also the convener of the Climate Governance Commission that was recently established by the Global Challenges Foundation. So the aim of this commission, the Climate Governance Commission, is to fill a crucial gap in our way of tackling the climate crisis by convening leading policy experts from various fields and from all over the world, with the aim of identifying innovations and reforms of international institutions and global governance structures. That is the way we take and implement collective decisions on a global level that would facilitate and speed up the solutions that already exist for a more effective climate action. So another aspect of the Commission's work is to think about climate governance reforms as a way to reform our way of governing the globe in general. The climate emergency is a very urgent emergency that we are facing right now, but it's far from the only one that we are facing together on this planet that we inhabit. We are also facing various other potential global catastrophic risks, and with climate change, that is such a complex problem that if we manage to solve this problem, then we will be better equipped to tackle other risks also in the future. So this is also the topic of this session of the UN 75 Global Governance Forum. And it has also been the topic of a process that have preceded this forum, including a number of global and regional policy dialogues that have been held during the last year or so in different parts of the world, and also a webinar and e-consultation process that we held in August that some of you may have participated in. And this process that has been going on for the last year has resulted in a number of reform proposals that you can find presented in the roadmap for the future we want and the UN we need, which you will find on the webpage of this forum. So please read that, and please get back to us with any feedback you have on these suggestions in the roadmap, because this forum will hopefully prove to be a milestone on the road to improve global governance, but it's certainly not the end point. So please continue the discussion. We have a really distinguished panel with us today to discuss these issues. First, I want to say a very warm welcome to Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, also former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and currently chair of the Elders. The Elders is an independent group of global leaders which was founded by Nelson Mandela that work together to promote peace, justice, human rights, and good governance throughout the world. And among many other contributions to global policy debates, Mary Robinson has worked extensively on climate change, particularly focusing on climate justice. For example, she has served as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on Climate Change, and she's also the author of the book Climate Justice and founder of the Mary Robinson Foundation on climate justice. So very warm welcome to you. We also have with us Wanjira Maathai, who is Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. She is also chair of the Wangari Maathai Foundation, and she has been the leader of the Green Belt movement for many years. And she has also recently kindly accepted to be a member of the Climate Governance Commission that we have initiated. And thank you very much for joining us, and very welcome to this discussion. We also have with us Arunabha Ghosh, who is founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is based in Delhi, India, and which is one of the leading climate policy think tanks in the world. Arunabha Ghosh is also a member of the UN's Committee for Development Policy, and like Wanjira Maathai, he has also kindly accepted to work with the Climate Governance Commission with us. Arunabha Ghosh is also author of one of the proposals that you find in the roadmap to the future we want and the UN we need. So we will begin by asking the panelists a number of questions. We should also have with us Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, who is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada and who is currently also chair of the World Refugee Council, but I cannot see that he has joined us yet. So I hope that we will have Dr. Lloyd Axworthy with us in a minute.
Yes. Yeah, it'd be great to introduce him now, and hopefully he can join.
Yeah, so Lloyd Axworthy played a key role in two important and successful processes in global governance innovation that are really relevant for our work here. The first one was when Canada and Austria together took a lead, and I must say very creative role in the process that resulted in an international ban on anti-personnel landmines in the 90s. At that time, there were international negotiations going on such a ban, but they had got stuck due to resistance from some countries. When Lloyd Axworthy, as Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, seized an opportunity to create a new fast track towards a convention that was spearheaded by Canada and Australia, and that resulted in a legally binding agreement that was signed a year later by 122 countries in Ottawa, Canada. And as a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, Lloyd Axworthy also initiated a process that established the UN principle known as the R2P, the responsibility to protect, which is directed to protect people threatened by genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So I really hope that we will see Lloyd Axworthy joining the panel in a minute. There might be some technical issues that prevent this. So we will begin by asking our panelists a few questions. Maya and I will share the responsibility as moderators, and then towards the end of this session we will also have room for questions from the audience. And for to participate to ask questions to the panel, please put your questions in the Q&A function of this that you find in the Zoom window. So not in the chat box, because then we will not be able to see and follow what happens. Please use the Q&A function to put questions to the panel. Thank you all for joining us here, and I will leave the word now to Maya to pose the first question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Magnus, and very warm welcome to our panelists and to all the participants on this webinar. Yes, so as Magnus noted, we'll go through 3 rounds of questions with our panelists, and then we'll have time for participant questions at the end. So please do put your questions in the question and answer chat box. so that we can extract your questions from that chat box. So the first question we'd like to pose to our panelists is, from your various vantage points, what do you see as the main bottlenecks and barriers to effective global climate action in our current system of global governance? And as background, of course, we all know that the gravity of the climate emergency has been well known for quite some time. And there are also well-known and working solutions that could be implemented today that would have a good chance of keeping us within a safe operating space in terms of the planetary climate system. But still, sufficient action is not happening, and at least not at the pace that is consistent with the commitments of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. Why? Why do you think this is the case? What is stopping us from doing what we all know needs to be done? So in order to hear your perspectives, we can perhaps go in the following order, starting with Mary Robinson, Wanjira Matai, and then Arunabha Ghosh. So President Robinson, over to you first.
Okay, thank you. And it is a very important question. I remember, because I was the special envoy of the Secretary General at the time before Paris, the leadership role played by France. You know, every French ambassador was out there beating the drum on it. We have an important conference next year. It's been postponed to next year in Glasgow, COP26. The UK needs to actually step up in a similar way. We need to actually see that kind of leadership. But worse than that, we've seen non-leadership. We've seen President Trump attempt to pull the United States out, which he can't do until the 4th of November, 2020, which is the day after the presidential election. And Vice President Biden has made it clear, if he succeeds, he won't take the United States out. On the contrary, he has good plans for a Green New Deal. So it's a mixed bag. We have populism, we have nationalism, we have trends that are not going in the direction of good multilateralism at the moment. And we need good multilateralism and solidarity to resolve this issue. But just today, we had an example of leadership. I was very impressed by the State of the Union address by Ursula von der Leyen on behalf of the European Union. You know, the European Union is stepping up. It has its Green New Deal, it has its strategy on biodiversity, it has its farm to fork, which is better than the previous common agricultural policy. And today, she made the emissions target 55% reduction by 2030. I'm telling you, that will have my country, Ireland, really having to step up. And then she said some very good things. Even, you know, the point about, you know, not having a system that puts such value on wealth instead of on people's lives. And, you know, her European Bauhaus proposal is very novel. That could be very interesting to have architects and artists coming together. We need new ideas, a new kind of sense of resolve. And I think she really helped by giving leadership for the European Union today.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And just as a small follow-up question, in terms of the UK really stepping forward in a leadership role with the upcoming very important COP26, how can we all support the UK and those working on COP26? And for example, what are the elders doing to try to support them as much as possible to make it a success?
The elders are very keen, obviously, that COP26 is a big success. The first thing that needs to happen is ambitious, nationally determined contributions, particularly from the big countries. And as yet, we don't actually know what the UK's nationally determined contribution is going to be. So that clarifying that would be an important first step, and clarifying it very ambitiously.
Yes, I am.
I think Lloyd Axworthy, I'm happy to say.
I'm sorry, I just
welcome, Lloyd. Welcome. And
I'm sorry, I had trouble
Lloyd,
with I had trouble with the Zoom getting in. I don't know what was going on. But
yeah.
Okay, well, wonderful to have you with us. And we'll go to Wanjira and Arunabha first for the first question, and then I'll say the question again, and then you can give us your thoughts. So Wanjira, would you like to share your views on this question? And I think you need to unmute.
There we go. I think that unmutes me. Thank you, Maya, and thanks. Delighted to be here with everybody. You said it. We know what needs to be done. Why isn't it happening? I can speak from the African perspective and just say that there continues to be a very deep crisis in justice around the world, and climate justice is not immune to that. We've seen that across the globe, the reckoning around race relations, equity, and now, and in this particular case, around the issue of transparency in the climate process. And I think for this, the COP remains, as you said, the most important process, especially for countries in the global south, to engage in global governance. And so this becomes a very important platform. And the lack of transparency or the lack of trust that is perceived is one of the biggest hindrances to achieving what we need to achieve in global governance. I think we need to, especially with the COP coming up and the momentum that we're building, we need to build more open relationships with African institutions that are working on adaptation and address the issues that they're concerned about. Resilience is an incredibly important issue for Africa today. And if we don't address that issue, as far as most of the people in the global south, we're not addressing the governance issues and the climate issues that matter to them. So these processes have to be inclusive. And then the second, I think most important, is around financial flows. We've got to see the financial flows coming in as committed so that there is that commitment to seeing climate justice happen. Really important issues coming down the pike, especially highlighted by what COVID has taught us around what we need to do to build resilience. Africa will be looking at an industrialization agenda that could very simply go the wrong way if we do not invest in the sort of just transition that's needed to make that energy transition happen. So those are sorts of the things. And I think in this case, climate is really about, the governance issue is really going to be around about justice, and it's going to be around building trust.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Keynotes of justice, building trust, investment, sufficient financial investment, and getting countries around the world on the right track, including developing countries, to really build back better. Arunabha, over to you.
Thank you, Maya. I agree with what President Robinson and Wanjira have said in terms of the lack of leadership as well as the lack of trust. But I think there is something else that's missing. In 2015, for the Paris Agreement, we changed the architecture, where we went from a top-down model of global governance for climate change to a bottom-up one. But what we've not done is that within our countries, we've not gone bottom-up regarding climate action. And what is missing? What are the conditions in which that kind of systemic change happens? One condition is, when you think about systemic change, is that the simpler the action, the more powerful its message. Think about, Gandhi's Salt March. Think about the Chipko movement in India in the 70s, where rural women went and hugged trees, and they kicked off a wave of environmental consciousness. We need that kind of empowerment in terms of simple actions to get communities energized. Another thing that has been missing is that system change happens when there is a confluence between the interests of the vulnerable and the interests of the elite. The pandemic shock that we are faced with is one example, because no one is spared. Of course, in terms of recovery, some will benefit more than others. But when we begin to think about climate risks, Wanjira mentioned the word resilience, from a point of view of something that affects all of us, it's possible that we'll get more action. A third thing which is often missing is that we don't have a credible statement that rejects the acronym TINA, there is no alternative. So the proponents of the old economy will keep saying there is no alternative. And we have to come out strong to reject that statement, not just in ideological terms, but in using the evidence of technology, finance, and policy to say there is an alternative. Which brings me to the fourth and most important thing. Just as we empowered countries to come forward with their nationally determined contributions in 2015. We have to now empower communities. If communities seize that agency, then the politics of extremism that we are witnessing across the world will perhaps be mitigated a little bit. Because unless that happens, unless communities are taking charge of their own resilience, we can have all the change in the global governance architecture, but we will not be able to take people along with us on a different pathway.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Arunabha, for those perspectives. So Dr. Axworthy, perhaps we'll move to you next for this first question, and I'll just repeat the question for you. So what do you see as the main bottlenecks and barriers to effective climate action in the current system of global governance? We know it's a very grave problem. We have a lot of technical and policy tools at this point. What are the blockages and bottlenecks that you see are key?
Well, I would like to begin really with thank you, and I apologize for coming in late. Whatever happened to the Zoom mechanism didn't connect with, but I'm glad to be here now and to join your company and to have a conversation. I want to pick up on a couple of things I just heard as I did sort of connect in. To me right now, what is happening is this confluence of these issues, the climate impact, the ongoing conflicts that take place, the epidemic. All of these are, if you want to call it a perfect storm, I guess, remember, it used to be called the black swan, where you just have a sense of an enormous impact with so many unknowns, and that all the prescribed conventions and ways that we've been used to trying to manage or cope simply don't apply. That is certainly becoming, to me, really, I don't know if you want to call it the existential threat to humanity, but I think the inability to really come to grips with the combination and the integration, the overlapping between those issues. Just to go back to a previous comment, there was a report just issued just a few days ago from the Global Observatory about how in the Sahel region of Africa, you've got this combination of extremism that's feeding off the epidemic resources because they are simply being concentrated to deal with the epidemic, but there's a result, there's a shrinkage of the other things on security and on enforcement and on public health. So you've got this kind of taking advantage at the same time because of what's happening in the Sahel and the drying up. That feeds into the epidemic. You're all of a sudden finding that there's a lot more pathogens, the ability to cope with it. There's that classic case of corruption becoming a part of this kind of toxic brew that I'm talking about. And then you've also got then the question of how do you manage it? And I think right now we're struggling, partly because there has been such a regression in the commitments to any form of international collaboration. Most of the large countries, beginning, you've got Russia, China, the United States, who in their key role in the Security Council just refuse to do anything. And to them, that's the playground in which they fight out their little battles or their big battles. And as a result, it is just paralyzing, in many cases, any discussion about the whole security. Some of you know, I know Mary does, that from back when I was in foreign affairs, we talked a lot about human security, that we had to really kind of transmit our lens towards the impact on people from national security. Well, that no longer is being used as a lens on which to work at. I'm not saying exclusively, but I think that the geopolitics that we're facing right now is really quite horrendous in terms of the pulling out of resources for the WHO, the cancellation and rebuttal of Paris Accords. The SDGs are in big trouble because of the withdrawal of funds and resources that are being redirected to domestic or local forms of epidemic recovery or epidemic remedies. And then you have, combining with that, sort of a real loss of the sense that I think over the last 20 years or so, the progress that was made in dealing with issues of poverty, issues of empowerment, issues of involvement, that's a real regression that's going on. And let me, if I might, just give you one working example. I chair the World Refugee Migration Council, and part of our mandate is to try to provide a platform for direct participation. So about 6 weeks ago, we held a conferencing, a digital conferencing, which included about 700 refugee women from around the world, to talk about how was COVID beginning to impact them. And the one phrase that came out that was repeated over and over is that they're at the back of the queue, that they're no longer, and when it comes to action, when it comes to support, when it comes to resources, nobody speaks for them. There's no governments who are out there providing a representation, and that they themselves are really being, have found that the frameworks that have been built up in refugee camps and the concentrations in urban areas are now falling apart because the international NGOs have had to pull back because of COVID. So they're having to redo the whole governance, legal rights issues. As a result, you've got a real problem right now with the attack. I mean, we only have to see what's happening in Greece, in Lesbos, and the lack of international action to take care of 13,000 refugees sleeping on the street. There's nowhere else to go. Greek government's going to build another kind of incarceration center, but up to then, women are being violated, kids are starving, the whole system is broken down. You can say the same thing is happening in the Sahel. You can see the same thing we're dealing with through our council with an issue with the Yazidis of northern Iraq. 600,000 Yazidis being pushed back out and being attacked by local militia. ISIS is still on the scene. And as a result, where's the international action? I mean, there was a time that we were able to say, look, if there's a responsibility to protect people, that doesn't exist anymore. And to me, that's a big fundamental failure. And right now, to go back to Mary's point of President Robinson, that the leadership, I keep saying this, we don't have a refugee crisis, we have a leadership crisis, because no one's taking it on. And in fact, I think that to me represents one of the great compelling things. The only antidote, if I just take one more minute, is in this digital conference I talked about, it did demonstrate how you can redesign and reset the notion of like almost a global democratic process. I mean, we were able to have thousands of women being able to participate. And since then, we've had follow-ups in very specific regional issues in which the opportunity, so the old idea of the UN is we'll bring together 200 people in New York and listen to them. That doesn't work anymore. I think we have to get into a much more participatory form, and the digital system enables us to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So very sobering comments, of course, of what we're all seeing with the convergences of various threats together with the pandemic, with climate, and then the leadership crisis, but also very helpful to share really what people are seeing and feeling on the ground, and these glimmers of hope or possibility with more participatory global governance, which is extremely encouraging. Okay, Magnus, I think I shall turn it over to you for the next round of questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, our panelists, for your answers. And again, very welcome, Dr. Axworthy. I presented you before in the introduction, so very happy to have you all here. So now we have heard some good analysis of what the barriers and obstacles are, what is preventing us from doing what we all know that we should do, together to escape this crisis. But so what? The next question is how to overcome these barriers. What possible changes in the global governance architecture do you think would be most effective in overcoming those barriers and facilitate the rapid transition to a more sustainable way of life? And I would like to ask first Arunabha Ghosh about this. And you, as I said in the introduction, was also one of the authors of the author of one of the proposals that is now in the roadmap. So in that contribution, you discussed some concrete measures to ensure a green and just recovery from the current global crisis. Could you give an example and say something about how that overcomes the barriers that we have been focusing on here?
Sure, Magnus, thank you again. You know, in terms of the response, which would be both a response to the acuteness of the crisis that we have in terms of the pandemic, as well as the chronic crisis of climate risks that we face, let me put forward two quick ideas. You asked for one, I'll try and squeeze in two. The first is what I call a global risk pooling reserve fund. And let me just quickly explain what that means. Today, thanks to the pandemic, we've got perhaps up to 100 million additional people who will slip back into extreme poverty. And yet, all the low-income countries in the world will rather get a pandemic insurance payout from the World Bank up to about $130 million, all put together. That's less than what Wimbledon alone gets in as its pandemic insurance recovery of $141 million. That is the injustice and the inequity that we have in the world. Now, what would a global risk pooling reserve fund do? It would pool the extreme climate risks, the tail end risks that we're not paying attention to, that are different in different parts of the world. In some cases, it could be drought. In some cases, it could be floods. In some cases, it could be coastal extreme events, and pool them together so that you reduce the curves, lower the curves in terms of the risk, and thereby create a fund capitalized by a voluntary allocation of the IMF's SDRs. So that when extreme shocks, whether it's public health or it is climatic, hits above a particular threshold, the fund is able to pay out. And yet in the current circumstance, no country has to put out any real money because it is an allocation of the paper money in terms of the SDRs. This would create a much larger capital to create that resilience that is missing and create an insurance cushion. One more quick proposal is that, again, when Gira talked about industrialization in Africa, there's industrialization happening in emerging Asia and in emerging South America. So the heavy industries that use fossil fuels, that's hard to abate, steel, cement, fertilizers, how can we begin to substitute for the fossil fuels used there? And I proposed a global green hydrogen alliance. Green hydrogen. So the hydrogen is produced from renewable sources, not from fossil fuel sources. The current costs are extremely high, but again, if a group of countries, rich and poor, pool their technologies together, pool their scientific endeavors together, pool cash and in-kind contributions, you can create an international research platform that can significantly lower the delta between using coal in steel plants and using green hydrogen. If we can bend the curve on emissions there and create, through our Green Hydrogen Alliance, and create an insurance cushion for the world's most vulnerable communities through a global risk pooling reserve fund, I think we'll have something innovative that can build the trust again that both Mary Robinson and Wanjira Maathai were referring to.
Thank you very much. So the next question I will ask Wanjira Maathai to comment on this.
Could I interrupt? And I hate doing this, but I'm going to have to leave very shortly. So if you want me to come back for a question, I'd have to do it now because I have to leave for another Zoom very shortly.
Okay.
Sure, I can ask the question to you for this round quickly before we go to Wanjira. Apologies for that. So yes, President Robinson, you have stressed the importance of climate justice and of local climate action, which we've heard from some other panelists. So in your view, how could international institutions and decision-making processes better incorporate and support these perspectives?
First of all, I really apologize for jumping in, especially because Wanjira is such a friend, and I loved the fact that she identified justice and climate justice so strongly initially. And also Arunabha talked about a community bottom-up way of influencing the Sustainable Development Goals. And Lloyd talked about, migrant women being at the back of the queue when it came to addressing it. So all of these are issues of justice. And I think it really is important to recognize that when we talk about climate justice, there are at least 5 layers. And I'll briefly identify them. The first layer is that the climate change disproportionately impacts the poorest countries, the poorest communities, indigenous peoples, small island states, who are least responsible. And there's a racial injustice to that because these are Black, brown, and indigenous people. And we've seen COVID, even in the United States, impact disproportionately in that way. Within that, there is the gender injustice, that women have narrower social roles, less power, often less rights, like land rights. The third area is the one the children have reminded us of, the gender injustice, and the fact that we're not taking our responsibility to give them a good future. The fourth area is subtle, but it's very important, the injustice of the pathways to development. Industrialized countries built their economies on fossil fuel. Developing countries have to take their people out of poverty based on clean energy, and they're going to need the technology, the investment, and the support for that. And for the industrialized countries, we need a rapid, just transition to wean ourselves off, and we need that green hydrogen alliance that I really like. And the fifth layer of injustice is to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. It's really incredible how urgent this is. And COVID has given us important lessons. And again, I'll just very quickly identify 4 of those. The first one is that actually collective human behavior matters. It's the only thing that's protecting us from the virus. It's our ability to comply with social distancing, hand washing, guidelines, etc. And our collective behavior will matter when we're coming to deal with the climate crisis by changing our consumer habits, consuming less, producing less, having less waste, circular economy, etc. Secondly, government matters. And I'm very glad that women-led governments are doing well at the moment in dealing with COVID. Thirdly, science matters. I want the same attention that's being paid now to health experts by governments to be paid to climate scientists. Let them stand side by side with government and determine policy going forward from a science perspective, because that will help greatly. And the fourth one is subtle. It's compassion matters. You're seeing people being much more open because we're all out of our comfort zone. It's not equal. COVID has exacerbated the inequalities, but we're all discomforted. And that makes us more open and have more empathy for the suffering of others. And that we need for the solidarity going forward. Thank you. And again, sorry to jump in, but I did want to say all of that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very shortly.
Yes, we were warned that you had to leave early. So thank you so much for jumping in and setting out so wonderfully the layers of justice and these really crucial points, the collective behavior, the collective momentum we need at community level at every country, every local population, and building the solidarity and empathy. Wonderful, thank you. Wanjira, I think we can go back to you now.
So thank you very much for these answers. So let's continue on this, on the same topic about climate justice and local action. And Wanjira Mathai, you have also you also stressed in your first answer the need to focus more on adaptation and reducing vulnerability, which is a side of the climate threat that we may not focus as much on, at least in the developed countries. We focus more on getting rid of emissions and not so much on the vulnerability to the effects of emissions. But so that is a very important perspective to take into account. But how do you have ideas on how could global institutions support that perspective better? How can we involve adaptation and vulnerability more in global governance institutions that tackle the climate change issue?
Well, there's a number of ways, and I mean, one of the major ones I think is to work with local African, global, Southern LDC institutions that are focused on adaptation. There are commitments to finance and share technologies that would support adaptation across the board. So that I think is one of the signals that are critically important. The other is just being inclusive. I mean, we've talked a lot about youth on this continent. You know, that's one of the things that is going to be a critical piece of the adaptation and resilience building equation. Young people, at least on the African continent, the median age today is 19 years old. So you have a very young population, 60% between the age of 19 and 25. How we deliver hope and promise to that cohort of young people is going to be a critical part of the solution. And if we look at nature-based solutions, for example, restoration, the restoration opportunities on the continent are great, and they provide real opportunities for jobs and for economic sustainability for young people. But we have to be transparent about the market opportunities for young people to engage. We have to make sure there's market predictability and price predictability, so young people can actually become real players. I know how offensive it would be to get involved in any market process that is not transparent. So we can say all we want, that we want young people to engage, we want women to engage, but if the process, the supply chains and the value chains are so messy, and deliberately so, and that's why I say it's important that they are transparent, that we won't be able to do that. So we've got to support some of the trade discussions that are currently underway. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is currently being fostered, and that will be an important part of how Africa moves forward to build resilience across different systems, the food systems being one of them. And we talked about manufacturing. So how we invest in adaptation and resilience is about investing in the people, and in especially the most vulnerable of them.
Thank you so much. Over to Maya.
A question for you next, Dr. Axworthy. So on the sort of governance, innovation, or trying to think proactively theme, Canada strongly supported and promoted the R2P principle during your time as foreign minister. And it has been sometimes suggested that an adjusted sort of R2P principle could be used or is needed for circumstances of mass grave environmental harm, which have international concern or consequences. So in your view, do you think there is a case for R2P in the context of the global environment?
In fact, I've done some writing about that exactly. When we developed the R2P principle, which is, as you know, is that the mandate for international action is triggered when the sovereignty of countries, which is not measured on the basis of how well they serve their public. And if there is, but it's always been focused on conflict-related issues. And that was the gist of the decision of the 2005 Leader Summit at the UN, that the idea was that that R2P idea would kick in if and when governments themselves were predators or would not control violence against their own people. we make the simple case that if you're being forced at the point of an AK-47, it's not much different from being forced by a major drought that totally exhumes all your resources. You don't have water, you don't have food, and your kids are starving. It's the same kind of transgression against individuals, against people. And that's why the definition of security, I think you have to start redesigning that so that the organs or instruments in the multilateral system can begin applying. To me, it's the great salvation of sovereignty by making sure that it works, as opposed to simply becoming a hindrance or a barrier to collaboration, which is now done. It's been taken over by the demagogues and the crazies and the bullies to bolster their own political position. And therefore, I think you need to have an alternate proposal. Look, using an example, the Chinese are very skillfully moving into the UN to take over human rights councils, agencies, and they have a very interpretation of what they consider multilateralism to be. For them, it is simply a way of guarding their privileges, not working on collaboration. We know where the Americans are. They're until we have an election, which we hope will be successful. You've got a government which is quite openly wants to undermine international institutions, and then you've got all the kind of hangers-on who kind of pile on. But even in the case of the European Union, which was for many the prime example of a large-scale collaborative effort between over 20 countries to work in some kind of common purpose, their failure to deal with the migration issue and their attitude towards migration, which is to be contained and to basically fob the problem off on the poorer countries, and that they'll help pay for it, but they're not going to do anything in terms of the issues of sanctuary and so forth. So anyway, my point is, I think you have to start with reframing a little bit the narrative, and I think you do that by saying there is a way of reconciling sovereignty with the idea of international cooperation. And I think that's to answer your question. But if I might just use the opportunity to say, but there are some practical responses to it. And I guess the one thing I learned in my tenure as foreign minister and since then is the importance of developing networks. And rather than we're talking about institutions necessarily, it's the networking that is going to provide an example. There's one going on right now where the Americans have deliberately tried to sabotage the World Trade Organization. Now, so 17 other countries have got together to redesign a form of dispute resolution that doesn't require them for the American judge to sit in jury or adjudication. So all of a sudden you've had a network of countries begin to mobilize. The same thing's happening in the climate. Here in North America, I know it sounds, I mean, again, you have a government which is in the United States that denies it. But what we have found here is our provincial governments and state governments have provided a collaboration, and they're also beginning to include the Mexicans. So the NAFTA agreement is actually acting as a kind of a crucible in which more informal networks, give them a name, they're not invisible, they're very active, but they're bypassing all the blockades and the barriers and the walls that are being built up. And I think that notion, so I think one of the key words that has to be introduced into the dialogue in terms of this conference on governance is the word connectivity. How do you make it work in diplomatic terms, in political terms, in sharing ideas and sharing? Our mobility has been severely restricted because of the epidemic, but it doesn't stop you from doing, there must be 1 million Zoom calls every hour around the world, but that is having some impact. I just described earlier in my comments about we had several hundred women being able to, for the first time, express themselves about what was happening to them on the ground, and also then take action by which they would become part of the solvers. That was the ultimate empowerment issue. They say, you give us some resources and some equipment, and we'll take care of the issues in the camps. Maybe just use, if I can just indulge you for a minute, one of the ideas talking about a network that we're working on at the WRMC is the whole idea of repurposing frozen assets. The World Bank last year estimated about $40 billion is sitting in piggy banks around the world by all the kleptocrats and the autocrats and the warlords who've siphoned the money off from their own people. Many of them are being held in major financial institutions. We know in our own country, in my own country of Canada, that there is embedded some very significant monies from some former dictators. We're proposing an idea that we have a repurposing of those frozen assets through the judicial system in our country to redirect them towards people who've been victimized, to the migrants, to the refugees, to the displaced persons. And what we're doing is we're trying to build a network. We've been working with the Germans and the Swiss and the minority party in the United States right now to begin to develop a network around which there could be a collaboration to repurpose. And if you start, not only does it provide a new source of major revenue, it also begins to provide an accountability. Because if you're a bad guy and you realize that your money is going to be attached, it becomes a much more difficult thing. So dealing with that corruption part of the equation is very important. But those are happening through networks. And I think that the big issue for the United Nations and many multilaterals is how do we integrate the kind of fundamental concept of nation-state participation with a much more a different set of representative democratic form of people, communities, and individuals.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Yes, shifting the narratives to human security, again, really at the center, and this notion of connectivity, which all these coalitions is sort of filling the leadership gap, it seems. Right. Coming out and these brilliant practical ideas to try to release ill-gotten gains and really employ them. That's a brilliant initiative to know about also. Thank you so much, wonderful. So Magnus, over to you for the last round of questions for our panelists.
Thank you, and we have already began to touch in, or you have already begun to touch in your answers the question I would like to ask. So we have now discussed a little bit about the basic problems that we're facing, but also what the solutions could look like. But the next question then is, how do we get from here to there? And we have a problem, like we try to reform the global governance architecture, which we have to do that within the framework of the existing architecture with all of its problems. And one of the things that have been pointed out in the discussions that have preceded this forum is that when you try to solve these problems with international agreements where you want to have global coverage and everyone needs to approve of the outcome, then you will tend to only reach like the lowest common denominator solution outcomes. So how can we get beyond that? How can countries that have countries or other stakeholders that have a more ambitious agenda also take the lead and push us further? And there has been this idea by William Nordhaus about climate clubs forming and creating a dynamic that will push the world further. And I would also like to address this question to you, Lloyd Axworthy, that I also touched upon in the introduction, that when in the landmine, the campaign to ban landmines and the negotiations that preceded that, they also got stuck. It was difficult to get beyond the countries that wanted to stop the process, but you then took a very creative found a new route to fast track that. Is that something that could also work with regard to climate change, you think?
Well, to answer you directly, am I on or off here? No, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. On the landmine treaty, I think you described it very well. The negotiation that took place through the Geneva-based Arms Commission, the only decision was how many parking places for the ambassadors around the table. I mean, it wasn't going anywhere because there's always a big sort of lever put in to stop anything that would actually require action. So, I mean, what we did is began to, coming out of the Ottawa meetings, initiate a process where like-minded governments, there were 7 or 8 governments to begin with, both North and South, combined with some international agencies. The International Red Cross played a very vital role because they designated landmines as a public health problem, which it is and was. Thirdly, we had sort of a very large civil society component, the whole sort of campaign against landmines, which, by the way, was initiated by Americans. The Veterans for Vietnam were the sponsors of all this. And what I think the diplomatic game was how to integrate those points. And we were able then to, a series of 4 or 5 meetings, become together both on the process and the principles and the product, and came out with a draft treaty, which was opposed, again, by big powers. I mean, the big guys were all opposed to it. But we went ahead nevertheless, and you know, we had 120 countries show up to sign the treaty. There's now over 160. The fatality rates dropped by 90%. And so it saved a lot of lives. And that, to me, is an example of how, but here's the key to it. Once that was done, we brought that back into the UN system. So it didn't become become a perpetual outlier. It was brought back in. Secretary General Kofi Annan at the time was very supportive. He spoke up publicly for it, but then we negotiated back in, so it became the UN as the agency would not only would register the treaty, but begin to collaborate and coordinate the anti-mine work and things of that kind. So it really was kind of a Mr. Outside, Mr. Inside kind of operation. And I think we're probably in that transition zone right now, because right now with the stalemate that's taking place because of the competition between the very large powers, we're going to have to work outside. And if I would have one plea coming out of this, there's a lot of great ideas out there, but right now, the suffering that's taking place in some of the examples I pointed out to, we have to find that same kind of coalition building around beginning to deal with the issues, say, in the Sahel, the issues that we're finding in Central America, the issues we're finding in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the sort of Rohingya in Bangladesh. Because right now, you know, there's a lot of proposals, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of stuff. The action is very limited. And I think that's where the political leadership comes in, is being able to find certain kinds of individuals, both in civil society, in the international agencies, and within certain like-minded governments, to come together really as a core sort of agency for bringing together the kind of networking coalition arrangements that we worked on for the landmine campaign. And by the way, it wasn't just landmines. We took the same formula and applied it to the International Criminal Court. The same idea of how do you meld civil society along with like-minded governments and international agencies. And so I think there's a pattern that could be used, and I think it has to be updated now. And here's going to be, to me, the crucial question, and I raise it to the other panelists. I think we have to really work on providing a clear partnership in the civil society world between the climate advocates and players with those who are also dealing with the migration issue. Because if there's ever a kind of a further bomb about to explode, we're now talking about tens of millions of people. You're seeing it in the western side of the United States today. They're talking about over 1 million people migrating out of those issues. The same thing is happening. I could take 15 other examples. They have to start coming together. They have to a little bit break out of that silo and say the advocates for conflict resolution, for climate adaptation and for migration management all have to begin to meld their activities and put together a much stronger international political coalition.
Thank you very much. So I would just like to ask Arunabha Ghosh and Wanjira Matai if you, what your comments to this, about your comments to this, and then I will leave the word to Maya again to ask, to put a few of the questions that have come up in the Q&A function. Arunabha, what are your comments? Is there a route to a fast track where countries and other stakeholders that want to proceed faster than what you can do in a all-encompassing international negotiation? Is that the possible route forward?
Sure, Magnus. When we ask the question from here to there, we have to also ask ourselves, what is there? Is there a reduction in emissions, or is there a destination where communities, vulnerable communities, become more resilient, right? These are two different end states, both desirable end states. But the coalition of actors that delivers resilience for vulnerable communities would probably be different from the coalition of actors that delivers new technologies that bend the emissions curve. So what we actually need, I mean, on a first principles basis, yes, it makes complete sense to try and get a critical mass of coalition actors to act. But once we begin to unpack it, we have to ask ourselves, who's going to come together, like I proposed earlier, in an alliance on green hydrogen, which will be different from who's going to come together on an alliance that pools risks to create insurance cushions for vulnerable communities. One thing that can string a lot of, as Lloyd Axworthy was also saying, that can bring in civil society as well, is actually the need for much more localized, high-resolution data. Why do I say this? The pandemic has left governments either completely paralyzed because politically they're not responding to their populations, or because they simply don't know enough about how bad it's getting. If you extrapolate that story, when we think about perfect storms of climate shocks, droughts, agricultural crop losses, flooding events in the cities, affected coastlines and so forth, you're talking about a series of shocks that governments are going to truly struggle with in trying to even respond, even if we assume that the resources were there. That's so one thing that can bring a lot more actors together and get action going is something I've proposed elsewhere of a climate risk atlas for developing countries. This is something that developing countries, no developing country today has at all. So at a high resolution level, at a 25 by 25 kilometer grid level. And when you think about risk atlases like that, you can layer it with other information like refugee populations, like particularly vulnerable classes of society, like particularly vulnerable infrastructure. You can begin to bring together different types of information, which then gives you a lever to create those coalitions across issue lines. And that's when the migration people and the climate people and the public health people can come together and again build that resilience bottom up.
Thank you very much. So we don't need a climate club, but we need several different climate clubs addressing different issues. Wanjira, what is your comment?
Well, I wish I could say that we have exhausted the utility of the existing processes. I really think the question we should be asking is, how do we get more accountability from all the parties involved within the process that we have right now? We haven't exhausted it, because at the moment, when you look at the situation with the NDC process as an indicator, we're seeing developing countries, least developed countries show leadership in ambition. That should not be the case. And so we have got to be finding ways. I wonder whether we can find that club, that will hold people accountable. Accountability is the missing piece here, because we have a situation where the NDCs and even the long-term strategies are giving a very clear pathway for what needs to be done. Certainly for least developed countries and for the larger global South, there are very clear asks on the table, especially of the climate process. And we have not seen any indication, certainly not sufficient, around financing, around loss and damage. And we're seeing what's going on now with the flooding and the damage that's going on. We've got to begin to address some of these issues. And whichever infrastructure we create, the crisis will often always be accountability. So how do we get that out of whatever process we define? Because whatever process we define, we will have to hold the parties accountable. So I would argue we need accountability, and we need a way to define that and hold parties accountable.
Thank you. Maya, have you found some questions from the audience?
Yes, I have indeed. And so yes, just a note to all participants, please do put your questions in the question and answer chat box, but we should have plenty to keep us busy already for the next 15 or 20 minutes we have for questions from participants. And what I shall do is just read out 4 questions and then go to our panelists. And please just choose 1 or 2 questions you'd like to respond to. Don't feel that you need to respond to every question. So firstly, a question directed primarily to Lloyd Axworthy about the human security concept. The questioner notes it's critical in the current crisis. How do we effectively re-engage with this framing, and what could be done differently now? Secondly, on the issue of trust, what would be a simple and compelling action to build trust on climate action globally, and what role could academia play in creating a new environment? In terms of leadership, question or comment, firstly, it was reported today that New Zealand has been made climate risk reporting by the financial sector compulsory. Will others follow? How could this become an international standard? And finally, a sort of archetypal global governance question. As long as nation states continue to set priorities according to their borders, will any solution really work? So lots of questions to work with. Lloyd Axworthy, perhaps we can go to you first on the human security concept.
Yeah, sure. It's a question that I sort of think about a lot, and try to put that in the context of the kind of world we're living in, when the whole area of collaboration and protection of people is just been really pushed to the edge of the desk. That's part of the problem. The politics right now, compared to what we had in the 90s and going into the early part of the millennium, has really been thwarted, and oftentimes under deliberate attack by those people who have arisen to power by exploiting grievances. And we will get into all the reasons on which we're being dictated to by what I would call a posse of autocrats who are there simply and using the trigger words of nationalism and of self-protection as the way to exercise control and power within their own jurisdiction. But there are still some remnants. I think this actually relates to one of the other questions: how does academia play a role? I think by taking the human security concept and applying it to this new convergence of climate epidemic related issues that are there, and begin formulating that. I think there's countries out there, I think the whole notion that what Jared was talking about, what's happening in Africa, she's absolutely right. I go back to the work in the Sahel, it's ECOWAS and the African Union and others which are trying to put together the kind of coalition. What's missing in this is that, with the exception of the French government, the international community is not providing the backup, the buttressing, the amplifying that needs to take place. There is a kind of human security network still existent at the United Nations, a group of about 20 countries, along with a certain number of civil society groups. But they right now don't have much traction, to be honest with you. And I think that it needs a revival, really, of the idea, but applied to the issues that we now face. Because part of the problem is that it became stuck really
Yes.
in the idea that this is purely an issue dealing with conflict and forceful violation and displacement. Now I think it has to be applied to the kind of conditions. And when we go back to this idea of how do you, I think that the idea of looking at the different dimensions of it, say on climate, providing resolution, solution, adaptation, and a form of emission management. There's enough room in there for a lot of people and a lot of space. There's a lot of political space opening up. And I go back to, I don't want to sound like I'm kind of a record, but I go back to the idea that I think that the connectivity capacity gives us a real opportunity. What's missing right now is any government that really is being able to kind of ride that and have enough weight and trust to make it work. Perhaps Germany right now is the only one under Merkel that is providing that leadership. Although I think in some cases, and Jerry, you could emphasize that, but one of our council members is Ayub Chub, who's the African Union Youth Envoy. And I'm interested about just how the African Union is still applying kind of like some human security principles to the work they're doing in terms of protecting people and their members. So that's a little bit of a scattered answer, but I think it really does mean it's going to have to be a little bit of a I wouldn't use the word coalition. I would use it almost as a form of compact that has to take place between some of the players that we've been talking about to redefine it. And as the UN faces its 75th, it's got to tackle the issues of money. It's got to, by, for example, providing the discussion they're now having about a digital tax that could be employed to again raise revenues for doing some of the development and work that is required. And that's where the new thinking comes about. But we also have to find the forum, and maybe this particular morning with the idea of the one governance issue. I would hope if you're looking at takeaways, that would be one of them. There's got to be some of that leadership shown.
Excellent. No, thank you. That's an extremely helpful answer. And Wanjira, do you want to leap in now on any of those questions or related to Dr. Axworthy's comments?
Yeah, I like this idea of the human security concept, because we've been talking a lot about the fact that in all reality, the leadership in all our countries have a responsibility with respect to what's going on across the board. You look at what's happening to food systems, and we need to look at what issues of justice are in the food systems. And in fact, people now saying that actually food security is a security issue. It is a matter of national security, and that every country in a situation like this, where food systems are interfered with and interrupted, we have got to find a way where countries can shorten the supply chains for their food so that they can reach them in times that now we know, like COVID, could be extremely disruptive. So I would love the opportunity to explore that as a concept. And I also think that there's great opportunities for institutions of higher learning. I think we're in this marathon on climate for the next many years, and we've got to begin training and investing in the future civil servants, those who will be innovating around how we address climate, and the students who will be creating the new innovations around how we govern. After all, maybe, Magnus, the new governance structures will come out of some of the innovative centers of excellence around the world. So how about if we created these centers and invested in these centers of innovation, climate innovation. I think academia has a great role to play in that area. So very exciting would be that opportunity as well.
Thank you. And over to you now, Arunabha, for any of those questions you'd like to respond to.
Yes, sure. I mean, just to pick up on what Wanjira said, yeah, absolutely. I think academic institutions and also non-academic research institutions like mine, you know, in many areas we have the largest data sets, whether it's on energy access, whether it's on industrial emissions. So having that granular data allows you to have more incisive policy and better action. But I wanted to just take up two of the other questions. One is on what New Zealand has done in terms of the climate risk reporting. I think absolutely, there is no question. My book on climate risks 5 years ago with Sir David King and others was launched in the London and the Bombay stock exchanges was precisely this reason, to get the financial community to wake up to the risk of climate change. However, here's the problem. In emerging economies, and Wanjira touched upon it at the start of this seminar, where's the money? Even if we issue green bonds, even if we issue the best policies, is the money actually flowing into the countries which need the clean energy infrastructure? 40% of the world's energy investment goes to 15% of the world's population. And 15% of the world's energy investment serves 40% of the world's population in many other developing countries. And that's happening because the cost of finance remains way too high. The perceptions of risk remain way too high than what you actually observe on the ground. So yes, while we should standardize climate risk reporting for the financial sector, we also need to hold the mirror to the global financial sector, that are you truly investing where you're meant to be investing to get better returns and have lower risk than you assume. The other point about nation states and setting priorities by their borders, well, that is the world we live in. And of course, we could hope for a very different world, but let's also work with this world. And I have proposed elsewhere that even in a situation where multilateralism seems to be on the decline, where their countries are taking on more and more nationalist positions, you can still have cooperation. Because in traditionally, countries would look for relative gains and losses when they negotiate around what are called dilemmas of common interest. So if you're striking a trade deal or something on global finance, but we all have an interest in averting dilemmas of common aversions. Everyone has an interest in avoiding pandemics. Everyone has an interest in avoiding extreme climatic events affecting their coastlines. So despite this negative feeling and mood around multilateralism, we still can bring large numbers of countries together to coalesce around dilemmas of common aversions and avoid the extreme risks, at least, that climate change poses before us.
Thank you, Arunabha. And Magnus, over to you. I think we have about 7 or so minutes left. Maybe a last question or two.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that we have time for 1 or 2 questions, and there are 2 related questions that I would like to that touches on the relation between climate change and refugees that Lloyd Axworthy was talking about earlier. So the first question is that knowing that the number of refugees displaced by disasters or climate refugees will exponentially grow in coming years, will the traditional refugee regime's ability will the traditional refugee regimes be able to cope with that displacement challenge? And what innovations could be doable to improve the capability of refugee regimes? And there was also another question, which was the related question is that the Geneva Refugee Convention does not legally recognize climate change refugees, and therefore international law does not acknowledge human rights violations due to climate change. So what would be the next steps to ratify and change that shortcoming. So who would like to go first on those questions? And we have only 5 minutes left, so please be very brief, if you can.
Would you like me? I'll take a quick run at that. They're absolutely right. The 1951 convention only warrants protection against political persecution. And that was based on the fact that it was designed post-Second World War, when there was large movements of people coming out of Eastern Europe, and it was a political thing at the time. Since then, there's been virtually limited ability to amend that. At the big compact meetings, Refugee Migration Council meetings in 2018 in New York, the UN sort of convocated, that was not on the table because it was a nation state multilateral system. A lot of countries were saying we're not prepared to deal with a change, and a lot of the NGOs who were involved didn't want to deal with the change because they were afraid if they opened up the 51 convention that it would give opportunity for the bad guys to further reduce and weaken the system. So I think that there needs to be a protocol, a redefined protocol that is really agreed to by, as I go back to the point I made, a certain kind of coalition of countries that could then be ratified by multilaterals, by the African Union or by the European Union or by the OAS, whatever. But that would have to, again, take that catalytic leadership that I talked about. Someone has to kind of get the thing going. And secondly, I think the finance has to be dealt with. I use the idea that we're working on how do you transfer tens of billions of dollars annually, and how do you also combat the corruption that goes with it? That's a form of accountability, by the way. It's a very significant. Money talks. You know, the old political science, follow the money. Well, if you're following the money and your money's gone, you have less reason to try to fill your piggy bank. But I think that is, to me, is the crucial question right now, is that redefinition of migration has to find some kind of international legitimacy. And even to the point where people don't have to be given full refugee rights, but they have to be given mobility rights, so they can still move and be able to draw in another country upon certain basic human rights in terms of their right to exist, their right to have an ordinary life. But there's also the possibility of being able to go back. And right now, again, that's a door stopper in the international community. It's just we're really, I don't want to overplay, but from someone who's in politics for 30 years, I just see the political shift going on, and there has to be a counter movement, counter force to that. And I'm still waiting for that to happen.
Thank you very much. And we have been told by the organizers that we need to end this session at 5 to the whole hour, because the next session will start at sharp. So I think that will have to be our last questions. And to wrap it up, it's very difficult to wrap up such a wide discussion, but this last question also points to one issue, and that have been present during the different times, and that is how the climate change issue is so complex and affects almost any other policy area, that we cannot tackle climate change in one box and the refugee issue in another box, and we cannot deal with finance governance in one box and climate change in another box, and development and climate change is so that also points to the fact that this is a crisis that also gives us an opportunity to really reform our global governance institutions. And if we succeed in tackling this challenge in a constructive way, then we will actually be very much better equipped to deal with any other future crisis that humanity will face. So thank you very much to Arunabha Ghosh and Wanjira Matai and Lloyd Axworthy for participating in this panel discussion. And thank you all for listening. And please